I want to welcome you today to a special video dialogue session on the topic of feminism, technology, and systems. I'm Ann Balsamo, a co-facilitator of the FemTechNet learning experiment called the DOC 2013 Dialogues in Feminism and Technology. And I'm here today with two very special guests. So Janet Murray is the Ivan Allen College Professor of Digital Media at Georgia Institute of Technology, and Brenda Laurel, who is a professor of computer science at UC Santa Cruz in California. This session today will cover a certain number of questions. They're actually very kind of broad and so on, and because we're taping, there will be moments when we may kind of start over or we may kind of stop and kind of move on to the next question. So I'd like to get started with a very broad question, which is to ask each of you to address a bit, how does your work first off, engage the broad topic of feminism and technology? So, would you like to start?
Sure. I guess there are a couple of main threads that I'm focusing on right now in my work. One is a continuing interest in human-centered design research. And what that typically means is dragging a bunch of computer science students out to meet someone who's not like them and say, this is who you're designing for. You might want to look in their refrigerator and talk to them a little bit. And I consider that to be a feminist enterprise because I'm a sort of an equity feminist kind of guy. I guess the other thing that I'm working on that is maybe closer to feminism and technology is a plan to do some visualization with biological data from the field in situated contexts where we have acute environmental problems in the United States, aimed first at policymakers. So the guy who's the senator from Vermont who has no idea what it means for the XL pipeline to go through Nebraska. What I'd like to do is create a set of scenarios where these guys can actually put their heads in it with valid data underneath and have some knobs, metaphorically speaking, to play with so that we get a little closer to responsiveness from our policymakers. And then I would like to scale that system to the point where we can run it on an iPhone or a Google Glass. I'd like to look down and see the rhizome, you know? I'd like to see who's living in that tree biologically and what the ecosystem is and what's happening and could happen, changing different variables. So that's where I am, and I think this sort of climate activism is a feminist enterprise.
Mm-hmm. So the most recent explicitly feminist project that I did was an NSF project to encourage women to become and to be retained in engineering courses. And the research actually shows, perhaps unsurprisingly to common sense, that women respond better to being engineers when they are reminded that engineers make things that actually help people, other human beings. And so it was a bigger problem that we immediately saw, which was that engineers in their first course called statics, which is a course that studies why things don't fall down, that this was taught with pictures in books of arcane objects like wheelbarrows that maybe some of our Georgia students might have seen if they came from rural parts of the state, but really, really specialized wheelbarrow. And so what we did was we took we took exercises that came from the lived world, and we made it clearer how those mapped onto the kind of abstraction that is characteristic of the way engineers think. So we were trying to demystify that magical thing that happens, which is a very complex intellectual move when an engineer looks at the beams of a room and actually sees the forces that are being held in check. And then we took scenarios from the real world, and scenario like the levees in New Orleans, and fanciful scenarios like a spider woman-like figure climbing up a building. And we found that women did respond more positively to these exercises, and that everybody learned better because we had mapped the real world to the abstraction and then to the mathematics. So it helped them to overcome the reflex of what they call plug and chug, where you just learn the formulas and then you look for numbers to put in the formulas, and then you don't actually learn how to think like an engineer. But once we were engaged in this process, it was a wonderful learning experience for me, which was that it became clear that there was an artificial separation in the curriculum. So I had naively thought that we could make exercises that people could experiment with and learn just how to counteract force by having things fall down. And this was rigidly opposed by my very progressive, very learning focused, we couldn't have better collaborating colleague engineers than we had on this project. They were totally opposed to anything falling down because that was dynamics.
And not statics.
Not statics. So, and you could just see how print culture had shaped the curriculum, making it less available and making it harder to think really complicated thoughts and learn well. So that was a good example of how the feminist thread sort of intertwines with the technological innovation thread. And if you're open, which I think feminism prepares you for, if you're open to a radical perspective, to saying, how come this is like this? I might see something that will call the whole system into question, and I might be right. Then I think that you can do more productive work that way.
So let's pick up the question of systems in both of your that you both kind of referred to in your opening kind of comments. Again, talk a little bit about kind of what is the concept of systems in your thinking, and what kinds of work does it kind of lead you to think about or to kind of focus on when you broaden from perhaps a more kind of narrow focus to something that really starts trying to conceptualize what is a system and how do we engage system or systems thinking.
You talking to me?
I'm talking to you. I'm talking to you. Talk a little bit about systems thinking.
Well, I think it's systems all the way down, to quote the famous turtle. And we're embedded in all kinds of systems and interact in odd ways: cultural systems, gender signaling, scientific systems, mathematical systems, economics, politics, you name it. They're all sort of a bunch of Venn diagrams in a three-dimensional bubble world. Oh, I love that. And I think that in the United States, just to agree for a moment with what you just said from the perspective of teaching design, one way to get at the problem of encouraging women to encounter technological expertise is to help them see it as a tool that's part of a larger system that has an outcome or a set of outcomes that are worthy. So I've had exactly the same experience with design students who've gone on to do quite technologically sophisticated things because they understood that this is a tool set that will get me not only from here to here, but to all these other places that I didn't even think about before, And you mentioned in your email, Janet, your interest in the issues around global feminism. So I'll just offer up an aphorism and an observation, and I hope maybe you'll respond to it. My notion is that a successful cultural intervention is injecting new genetic material into a society or culture without activating its immune system. Because if you activate its immune system, obviously, you're screwed. So, in terms of global feminism, we see successes like the Grameen Bank, which moved through part of the many intersecting bubbles of the system of society through crafting and through, to a certain extent, economics, into a place that was still safe for women to be involved with technology and economics. And that, in turn, wormed its way through a bunch of stuff that enabled these women to become more educated people and more aware of the world around them, including the affordance of the mobile phone. So it's that backwards, sideways, how can we make an intervention, say, for women in Egypt, through one of the subsystems that's gendered appropriate for them, so that we don't get the immune reaction from the religious society or the government, but we do open a portal where information and awareness can start to stream through.
So that's, I resonate very much to what, to your framing of it. And I also see us as confronting at this moment, at the beginning of the 21st century, this understanding of the world, which is the print culture has taken us to the point that we see the world as you said, as a 3D Venn diagram, right, with all these intersecting bubbles, right? But we don't have a way of sharing our sense of those intersections. It's a much more complex picture than you can represent in a 2D print world.
In a static world, even, because there are all these dynamics going on.
And right, because the bubbles have behaviors, they're procedural, right? So you need a way of sharing that picture with one another. So you're thinking very concretely and movingly about the immediate intervention at the ground level. I like to think about how do we get people's minds around the bigger picture, and how do we ourselves locate ourselves in this world in which we increasingly are aware of these women who are in such a different circumstance from our circumstance.
They're horribly oppressed in different ways.
Right, and that I think that is a feminist point of view, to be aware of them. So as you were talking, I thought of these two literary passages that have been very meaningful to me. One is a often quoted one from George Eliot, where a woman who was made a terrible marriage throws herself on the bed, and she's crying, and all of a sudden the narrator says, "But this is happening all around us." And if we were to hear everybody's cries, it would be like hearing the grass grow. And how could we bear it? Right? And then we had a portion that used to be in a Seder, a roll your own Haggadah.
Roll your
that
own
we did.
Seder.
Yeah, the only kind that worked, right? By Grace Paley, who's one of my favorite feminist writers of the late 20th century. And she talks in there, and I can't quote it exactly, of electronic media, essentially, and she's thinking of television, and how we see the disasters of the world raining down on us, and things that were hidden from us are now very immediate. And I think that it is a good part of traditional female role that we feel we're responsible for fixing it. We want to make it better. We want to take care of those people. So I think that to me, the technology is a medium of describing those things and understanding our place in those complex systems, and increasing that circle of empathy.
So one of the there's many points of connection between your work, although
You're gonna talk to her first this time.
I talk, but she just talked. Okay.
I'm so much more interested in what Brenda has to say. It's such fun to be here.
It is fun to be here. So I would like to ask you about 2 points of connection between your both of your portfolios of work, which are the points of connection about narrative and design, that both kind of suggest a kind of starting point. So the idea that you were both kind of thinking through narrative, trained in different kind of traditions of theater and of literary studies that really kind of take narrative as a kind of central construct to work through. So you've both kind of been thinking about narrative for a very long time, its functionality, its shape, how one kind of engages it, and so on, and then bridged from questions of narrative to then thinking about design, which is not exactly a kind of an obvious move, right? If you're trained as a narratologist or trained as an actor or a literary theorist, you don't necessarily make the move to thinking about questions of design, but both of you had, and you have in really interesting ways. So can you talk a little bit about that commonality that you share, this kind of interest in narrative, and how it was in some respects the kind of precursor to both of you then thinking and taking on the question of design, or thinking more complexly about design?
Well, I'd like to say something high-minded about narrative and design, but I didn't really figure that out until, 20 years into my career. I think for me, as an actor and a director and a theater person, there's nothing like the freedom of being an actor. There's all this freedom inside the words. Michael Chekhov wrote about this, and being in live performance and in relation to other people. And in the 70s, I was experimenting with interactive theater, so I wrote some scripts that were performed outdoors. I wrote a script about Robin Hood. Kids came and influenced the action and caused all kinds of havoc, and it was wonderful. So for me, the design of an interactive narrative was something I was already thinking about, because it was that day in the theater, the living theater, Dionysus and 69, Hair, all that stuff was going on. So, you laugh. Someone's seen Hair. I love it. Yay, all right. Culture is not forgotten, Hair. So I, at the same time, became involved with some guys who had a new home computer system that they developed. This is 1976. It was a little 1802 that hooked up to a TV, and one of my friends said, well, you know all about theater and stuff, why don't you come do some interactive fairy tales on this thing? And it just seemed like totally normal, of course. And what frustrated me...
What year was this?
This is 76. And what frustrated me was that we had 2K of RAM. We were loading a 200 baud off of audio cassette tape. That meant we had to have a converging node at the end of every load. So you couldn't make a choice that would really change anything, except maybe the color of somebody's dress, right? The story didn't get affected by what you did. So I became obsessed with this. And I think that drove me to Atari and to Atari Labs and later on to my dissertation and stuff. So that's how the boy ate the cabbage in my case. And you, Janet?
But let me just finish the story. And then the dissertation became the landmark book, A Computer as Theater.
Coming out October 4th, a new edition.
Good for you. So, and I'm struck by the fact that you got there before me. I thought I was going to be the
We were
the
separated
senior.
at birth.
Yeah. Because I was always interested in narrative, not as a narratologist, which is a European discipline and one way of looking at narrative. though I've been accused of narratology. It is a controversy in game studies, you may not be aware.
Yes.
But but I did my thesis, my orals. I defined the field that nobody had done that before at Harvard. It's ridiculous to think. In I don't know 1970 or something as narrative, as the history of the novel. And I've always thought that was where the meaning of life was. And that's why I didn't stay at IBM, where I worked in between college and graduate school. I graduated early from college, and I was trying to earn money to go to graduate school. And it didn't tempt me at all, because it wasn't the meaning of life. So
IBM wasn't the meaning of life. You heard it here first.
yeah. Well, and there was some impetus then to say that it was, you know.
Yeah.
But so I went and I thought, well, this was fun. This was like doing geometry in high school, or this was like crossword puzzles, but now, you know, serious things, novels. And then in 1981, my students showed me, or maybe 1980, my students showed me Zork and Eliza. And it was like a moment of revelation.
Yeah.
And I thought, this is Robinson Crusoe.
Yeah.
This is the first narratives, and let me get to George Eliot. You know, let's see how this is going to develop. And my interest in narrative had been combined with women's studies. So when I went to graduate school at the beginning, the second wave of women's studies, and we started discussing everything that was left out of the 19th century novel. And that was my first book, was an anthology called Strong-Minded Women, about all the things that were left out. And I thought, here is another way of framing narrative that is going to have its own expressive power. And this is really, so what will we be able to, what stories will we be able to tell here that we have not been able to tell in the existing legacy traditions?
And both of you, in that path of thinking about narrative and design and so on, both of you got very involved in game design and game studies. So people will kill me if I do not ask you both to talk a little bit about kind of the work in both of your work in intersecting with game design.
Yeah,
I know.
Okay. Let me make this easy. So I was a producer at Atari when they started the home computer division in 1979. They wanted somebody to help them figure out what to do with the computer instead of the video game machine to differentiate the products. Except the president kept asking me to push the games over to the computer side, and although some of them worked well that way, it generally speaking, it wasn't a good strategy. Since the video game machine was optimized to play video games. Anyway, I produced at Atari for 2 years. I produced for the computer Pac-Man and Dig Dug and Cat and Space Invaders and all of them, Battleship. And then I got the opportunity to go work for Alan Kay at the Atari Systems Research Laboratory, which completely turned my head around. I'd been working on my PhD project thinking about the relationships between theater and interactive design and how we might embed some theatrical principles into the real-time operation of games, so that the responses to people's actions and movements eventually might make some good dramatic sense. So Alan encouraged me in that direction, and I think he saved my life. When Atari tanked because of all those ET cartridges in the desert, which is another story, I just rode the range. I worked at Epix, I worked at Activision, I produced the Lucasfilm games at Activision. I was Timothy Leary's producer at Activision, which ended up being a lifelong, very dear relationship. Anyway, I finally got into a position with Interval Research in 1992. We're just finishing the Banff Virtual Reality Project. And the leader of Interval, David Liddell, was very interested in, why don't girls play video games? Because we could see that when you went into like a computer lab in a school, the boys would be banging away and the girls would be sitting in the back. This is 1992. It was a problem. It was a problem. And the hypothesis was that because the boys were banging around on video games, the hardware wasn't as intimidating, et cetera, et cetera. So we set about a 4-year project to discover what we might call gender differences in play and technology. So we were looking at a broad field. We interviewed about 1,000 kids, boys and girls, 500 adults, parents, experts, etc. And as we were doing this, we started coming up with design principles that we thought would work pretty well to get girls interested enough in what was going on the screen to actually put their hands on the machine. So that's all it took. The minute a girl gets there and does something, there's no stopping her. She will play anything. They're terrific FPS gamers from the early days that were girls and women. So I founded a company called Purple Moon, and we produced over 3 years 10 CD-ROMs, 2 different game series, a big website, some merchandise. We had a big launch at E3. We were in the top 100 the first year, the top 200 the second year. And our investors pulled the plug because the web came along. Economically, if you have products you have to put in a warehouse, your net worth can only be about 10x your annual revenue in the market. Whereas these web guys come along, they have no business plan, right? But they don't have anything in a warehouse, so their valuation can go crazy.
Vaporware.
And that was much easier money. Well, some of it was on paper. We're talking, Yahoo, Google.
Yeah.
So these guys just said, okay, I'm putting my money over here. We're shutting you guys down. We're selling you to Mattel. And it was like, are you fucking kidding me? Barbie is buying my company. But anyway, Mattel that year ate all the girl game businesses except a few. And it was like a snake that had too big a meal. It choked on it. It didn't have enough money left to service its brands, and its interactive division shut down, and Jill Barad lost her job. And I went home bitter, and then I got better, and I wrote a book.
Okay. Excellent.
That's quite a narrative.
That is.
Sorry,
No. That was
well,
perfect.
yeah,
That was perfect, and filled in a lot of details that we don't actually read about.
There's more. You have to read the second edition of my book.
Yes.
For the dirt.
I was more fortunate in some ways in being in academia, where you don't have to make money for in the short term, and posed other challenges, of course. There was when I had this inspiration of looking at Zork, which was a game, and at ELIZA, which was an artificial intelligence research project. I went to my dean and I said, we should do something to make things like that. And he said, go talk to the people in foreign languages, which must be called modern languages now. And they had simulations going that were procedural. And I said, let's make these on computer. So we started some of the first humanities, what would now be called digital humanities projects, and some of the first what would now be called serious game projects. But we didn't call them games. In fact, I used to tell my programmers when we were doing demos, they would say, well, and then the next thing in the game, and I'd say, don't say games, say exercise, because we were trying to understand how, what was the place of what we were doing, which were highly interactive, and I was still very focused on story. Then when I wrote about and I had this insight from that moment. This could be a medium like the film, like theater, like novels, and I wrote this book to prove that. And then Hamlet on the holodeck. And then when I wrote it, it came out in '97, but I'd been thinking these ideas all through the '80s as well. And I taught the first course in interactive narrative, which of course my students were making a lot of games in that context as well. When the book came out, game designers came to me and said, "Thank you, you have given us a language for what we do. This is really helpful to us." And because it was a moment when game designers were starting to talk to each other and understand that they were practicing a new art form and that they didn't have common terms for describing what they were doing. And then I like to say I got attacked by the nation of Finland. But actually, it was not all of the nation. It was a few very rude Finnish people, but who were trying in their own way. So there were these two communities: the game community, and there was also the game studies community. And there were people in Europe who were under the evil hegemony of narratologists, right? Not me, and who were trying to make a separate space for games. And what I took away from those very lively disputes, which flare up still from time to time, was where they said, don't let narrative colonize games. Games are separate. Narratology is evil. Now one of the chief people who said that calls himself a narratologist. But what they were talking about was structure, which was interesting. But what I took away from that was that games really were, that I became interested in games separately from narrative. Whereas when I was writing about it before, I was writing about some of the narrative qualities of game, as well as the possibility for non-game narrative. So that's been productive in other ways for my work.
So from the turn to games in both of your careers that was very rich and very evocative and productive, because both of you kind of really kind of experimented and kind of pushed our collective thinking. We started thinking more complexly about games, but based on both of your work, the design principles and the relationship of games as a kind of new expressive form or new medium. Then I think what I understand kind of also was happening was a kind of broadening of your understanding, or you could hear it even in your descriptions, a broadening to think about the system, the entire system that organizes these creative and intellectual or design experiments. So I could hear it in both of your descriptions that we're starting to understand things like the broader economic set of imperatives of why a kind of standalone. Excuse me.
You might want to restart the question.
Yes. That I hear in both of your accounts a kind of broadening understanding of how other elements of the system, in contrast to the thing you're working on, Girl Games, or the design principle for games, a real appreciation for how other elements of the system, or an awareness of a more kind of systems approach, starts foreclosing on possibilities or shaping possibilities, like debates among kind of intellectual perspectives and so on. So I'd like to just kind of turn the question a little bit to think about that kind of, I guess, to ask you to reflect on the notion of systems, again, systems thinking, and getting to a point where you're now designing in perhaps a different way, designing not, for example, the game or kind of the moment of an interactive narrative, but starting to understand what are the possibilities or the constraints of systems design, of understanding and comprehending or apprehending a system, and how does one design with that kind of an understanding, a broader understanding.
Okay, I'll jump in. So I think that the concept of systems intersects my work in a number of ways. One, the main way is the way that that Brenda articulated, of seeing us in cultural systems, I would say psychological systems, in small interpersonal systems and even when I was doing, well, let me just name them. So that's one way. Another way is is to see media, and particularly the digital medium, as one interconnected design problem. That anything designed in that space belongs in relation to everything else in that space. Which not being in academics and not having to make money out of it really helps you, because you can just be agnostic about what the platform is or how you're going to sell it, or you can see these larger trajectories more easily, and you're allowed to think about that. And then also from academia, there's educational systems, which you and I share an interest in, especially in building programs and in building curricula, and which you're contributing to now. I guess, and you were also at Cal Arts, so you also have been doing curriculum.
I was at California College of the Arts for 6 years and at Art Center for 6 years.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't know if that was as compelling to you.
Totally.
As totally curriculum, yeah. So then, because it's making the professional, and it's saying this is what knowledge of the field is, and I think I was just reflecting that there is a feminist thread through that, in that their legacy divisions have a lot of gender bias in them. You know, their traditional coding is male and macho, and art is more female, but when you start to see a new professional that has to know both, then you start to get more women in your program. You know, you start to get and you get more interesting combinations of design perspectives. So those three things, and I can pick up on any of them, I would say, would be the medium, the digital medium as a system in itself, the way in which culture works as these embodied, these embedded systems, and then the curricular system.
And all of those examples of systems, I think one of the ways in which feminism and systems thinking kind of intersects in both of your work and as you're talking about is understanding that systems aren't static. They don't get set up once and stay in place forever, that they actually are reproduced every moment of every day. But the question is that they are often reproduced in unconscious ways and infrastructured in ways that don't get kind of rejiggered. They kind of just get set up and they go, and although there's a dynamism to their reproduction, they don't necessarily change until someone starts thinking about how we want to reproduce differently. So seeing all of these systems as a kind of through a kind of reproductive technology lens, that if you want different kinds of insights or different kinds of people to be employed in fields and so on, you have to reproduce different kinds of people. Using the same structures, is not going to reproduce anyone different or someone who thinks differently. And so I think one of the combinations or the connections between both of your work on curriculum and systems thinking is thinking that how are systems set up And then how does one intervene in the system? And one way is you think differently about how the system is reproduced. Where does it get produced in the first place? Where do we get set up to occupy systems and understand our role in them and so on? And then rolling that back, how can we enable people to think differently about the system that both we inherit and the possibilities for doing things differently? So I'd like to maybe ask you about the question about kind of, thinking about literally reproducing differently, right? And that notion of when you think about your ecological kind of take on systems, that we think of the ecology as a system, but there's also a set of practices and understandings that have to be inculcated in order for that system to be transformed.
It's true.
Yeah.
So, just to start with the practical design education situation, there are a lot of methods in place in design, and they change all the time with the addition of technology and stuff. But one of the things I discovered early on, I founded the graduate media design program at Art Center and also the graduate design program at CCA. So I had the luxury of building the curriculum with the help of my friends. And one of the things I discovered early on is that there is not an explicit place in the handed down process of design for ethics or values. And on the one hand, you're telling students, go out and encounter people that are not like you and be open to who they are and try to meet them where they are and hang your biases at the door. But then later on in the process, as you move through it, you have to be able to pick your values back up and weave them into the work that you're doing so that it has some meaning in this world beyond being a chair or whatever it is. A quick story about a student who was having great difficulty at Art Center trying to figure out, she was trying to do a transmedia project for her thesis, and she was just stuck, smart woman. And finally one day I said, okay, what comes to mind? Go straight to your heart, take your brain down in there, what do you see? She said, dogs. I said, okay, that is your topic. You are doing dogs. And she did the most amazing work. It's chronicled in my book, but she had it rigged up where you could go into a pet store, do a profile, find the right kind of breed for yourself, locate examples of these dogs in various shelters, play with them through remote presence with a rope, get the dog, have a Bluetooth collar on the dog that would help you pick out products and dog blogs and, the whole thing. This was in 2005. And I can tell you 100 stories like that, where when a designer goes to their heart, what they learn is a practice of compassion and permission to be ethical in their work. And her concern was, I'll be known as the dog lady for the rest of my life. Well, she's never done that again. She's known as a fabulous designer, and she does great work for a lot of different kinds of companies. So I guess that's one thing that I've really learned about what you can do with systems is give people permission to be passionate and to be confident that whatever that kinky passion may be, it's going to get them there. It's going to help them get the toolkit right. And at the other extreme, which I won't talk about at length, is really, in my view, I'm now of an age where I'm preaching Gaian science to just about anybody who will listen, and making my students read Lovelock and Margulis and really think about the larger system that is the Gaian whole of which we are part, and understanding that it's our eyes and our consciousness right now that are causing a whole lot of things to go down. And we need to, I believe that we, anything we can do in the world of design or in the world of games, even if it's lighthearted, that bring people into awareness of that connectedness, not through words, but through experience, is a possible salvation for the situation that we're in. I'm sorry. I try to be optimistic. So, yeah. So ethics and ethics.
Okay, I think that we are almost out of time, so this has really been lovely. I want to thank both of you for being part of the video dialogue today that's going to be part of the curriculum for FemTechNet, thinking about, again, how to do things differently and encourage feminist thinkers of all stripes to engage with questions of technology and questions of possibility and questions of our kind of what are our ethical commitments to creating the futures that we will leave behind and that will be someday become the platforms for the way in which people will live in the future. So I want to thank you, Janet. Thank you, Brenda, for a really, really lovely conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thanks.
It was a
Thank
pleasure.
you.
It was a pleasure, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.